Well, folks, welcome back. We have some big news out of the state of Wisconsin. Current incumbent Senator Ron Johnson making hints that he may not run for a fourth term in 2028. That's right, 2028. We're not talking about the 2026 Senate election. We're looking at the 2028 Senate elections, when Ron Johnson suggested recently that he may not run in 2028. Which, if he decides to retire, not only would this open up a competitive toss-up state in a competitive state of Wisconsin, which we know can swing a lot, and it all depends on the electorate that turns out. In a presidential year, Republicans can have a good shot. Even in midterm years, they have a good shot. But in off-cycle elections, like the Supreme Court race earlier this year, we see that Democrats, the electorate that turns out is just much more favorable for the Democrat Party. And if he decides not to run for re-election, this would be the end of an era for a senator who is most likely, and I'd say the most outspoken conservative in the Senate. But let's jump into everything that we know as of right now. So Ron Johnson, obviously, he's the senior U.S. senator from Wisconsin, serving since 2011. He won his election back in 2010, beaten at the time. It was the current incumbent senator, Russ Feingold, and then obviously he ran against him again in 2016. Ron Johnson beat him out. Now, Johnson was a former CEO of a plastics manufacturing company in Oshkosh and rose really to prominence as the Tea Party-backed candidate in the 2010 Senate elections, obviously Barack Obama's first midterms. And he has been a staunch ally of President Donald Trump, supporting policies like the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and has been a vocal critic of the government overreach during the Biden administration, particularly on issues like the COVID-19 mandates and federal spending. And he's known for investigating different things like election integrity. Federal agencies, earning both praise and criticism from his party and from others outside of his party. But Johnson, he's a plain-spoken guy, and his style definitely resonates with just everyday conservatives who value really his willingness to challenge the establishment. But his seat is a critical seat for Republicans in a battleground state like Wisconsin, which swings between red and blue depending on the year. Now, this all comes from he was at I don't know if a fundraiser, was a press club at the Milwaukee Press Club on May 29th, when Johnson said that he, quote, doesn't want to run for a fourth term in 2028, but hasn't ruled it out completely. He said, quote, I learned in my second run, when I absolutely meant second and final, that you can never say never, and I don't want to. Which makes sense. And he, kind of goes on to say, look, I'm just a guy from Oshkosh. I'm just a normal guy trying to save this country. I'm not someone who needs this. I don't need the Senate title. I'm just a guy. It's kind of like the meme. I'm just a chill guy. But he's previously pledged to do this multiple times. So it's like initially he had pledged in 2016 to only serve 2 terms, but then ran again in 2022, citing really his duty to stay in the fight and how he would probably be the best candidate to win on the GOP side in Wisconsin, which it turned out he was. It's like that was a freaking tight election in 2022 when he beat out Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes by roughly, 30,000 votes here, like less than 30,000 votes, 26,718. It's an exact 1 point margin of victory in that race. And his reluctance definitely seems tied to his, personal desire for a sustainable path forward for the nation. I really think that he's one of these few senators who I actually think that he actually wants, something better for the country. I don't think he's just here to make money. It sounds like he had a decent amount of money, but you know what? I'm sure he's making plenty of money while he's there because, why not? But Johnson's learned from his past campaigns that things change. You say one thing 1 year and the next year things change. But he's definitely still leaving the door open in case, the political landscape shifts. If Republicans can't find a candidate that can actually work, that can actually win in Wisconsin in 2028, that's the big worry. That's the big worry, is that Republicans would lose this seat, which, I think it's fair to say that there's a high likelihood they could lose this seat in 2028 if Johnson does not run for re-election. Because remember, Wisconsin's a swing state. This is a state that voted for Trump by less than a point in 24, voted for him by less than a point in 2016, and voted for Biden by less than a point in 2020. So we're talking about a needle that's just barely shifting every year, barely shifting. And Johnson had a razor thin victory in 22 when he beat, like we said, Mandela Barnes in 2022 by a point. Exactly 1 point, just showing how competitive this state is. And if Johnson retires, it could spark a fierce contest within the Republican Party, with Democrats eyeing to flip and Republicans scrambling to hold this seat. And Johnson's departure would be a loss for conservatives who value his skepticism of big government and media narratives and his just plain spoken style. And potential, Republican candidates, you could look at, maybe Eric Hovde runs again. Maybe, former Representative Mike Gallagher would run in the state. But either way, they would face a tough fight in a state that it's a purple state. Like, there is no state that is more purple than Wisconsin. Like, if we're being honest. This is probably the most purple state in America as of right now. And although Democrats have gained ground in Wisconsin, especially, Tony Evers, he won re-election back in 2022 by, 3 points? 3.5 points, not a great margin of victory compared, he only won by a point against former Governor Scott Walker in 2018, still improved his margin of victory in Wisconsin, but still, it is going to be a tough fight. And, look, the Liberals control the Supreme Court. They won in 23, they won in 25, and we know in these off-cycle elections, it's who turns out. We know that these liberal voters tend to turn out in much higher droves for those types of elections than conservatives, than Republicans do. And a strong Democrat candidate could capitalize on Johnson's exit, making this a top Senate race to watch in 2028. So, what's next? What do we do? It's like Johnson has a history of reversing his term limit pledges, like 2016, like 2022. So there's definitely possibility that he could be persuaded to run if the stakes are high enough. And he's expressed alignment with figures like Elon Musk on reducing federal spending, indicating that he's still engaged in these core policy fights that are so vital to the future of our country. So vital. And his decision may hinge on the GOP's success during the 2026 midterms and Trump's second term agenda. Now, if he retires, he could return to the private life in Oshkosh, where he's from, leveraging his business experience, maybe take a job in a conservative media advocacy, maybe even be a consultant. We don't really know, but it would open the door for new GOP leadership. It's like he is the top dog in the GOP in Wisconsin, which could allow someone else, a new leader, to emerge in Wisconsin and shift the party's direction in the state. But if he runs, I expect a brutal campaign either way. But it's going to be brutal if he runs. Democrats are going to target his some of his stances on COVID-19, election integrity. While he does have a lot of self-financing ability, the national GOP support could make him and will make him a very strong incumbent in a battleground state like this. And like we said, I think a lot's going to depend on the balance of power in the Senate, how closely divided, what's the seat count, how bad would it be if Republicans lost Wisconsin, if it flipped to the Democrats. We'll see where you're at. But it would really be unfortunate. But I think this is the time for him. He aligns with Donald Trump on a lot of things. So this is the time for him to be there. But we'll see. Maybe after the time of Donald Trump is over, maybe he's over with too. Maybe he's ready to go back to his regular life and enjoy life, not be a lifer in the Senate. He doesn't want to die, basically, in the Senate. But that's going to wrap things up for today. There you have it. Ron Johnson potentially lean in towards not running in 2028. Let me know your thoughts down below. And as always, smash that subscribe button, hit that like button, and folks, we will catch you next time.